Oseredok. Today for my presentation, I thought I would go a bit off the beaten path and look at some of the examples of lesser-known discoveries that are regular occurrences when working with historical records, but do not often pass beyond the knowledge of the immediate user. When a record or collection of records is slated for archiving, it's because it's been deemed by an individual group or policy to have foreseeable and/or potential long-term archival value for future users. Such materials may provide insight into a way of life of an individual or the functions of an institution through the information they hold. This can include, but is not limited to, specifying dates of events, revealing evidence of relationship between individuals, agencies, and organizations, and providing insight into the thought process of a notable author. Processing records is an essential task for archivists since the end goal is to organize when necessary and develop finding aids in order to make these records more accessible for users in the future. And one of the tangible benefits of processing records is finding something interesting. And this could range from a particular item, a piece of information, or it could result from curiosity driving further research. What can be considered interesting is, of course, subjective to whomever is doing the records, and not necessarily applicable to the particular collection or fond. The media format on which information is stored can have a history unto itself, but this is not necessarily the intended focus of the fond. Or a newspaper may include an article that's of great significance to an individual or event, but will also include other articles that, while irrelevant, are still very interesting and entertaining on their own. This tangential information will often never be present in any major works produced by future researchers, but it is not without some value, even if it is in passing solely for the individual who discovered it. For this presentation, I will examine some interesting and tangential information I encountered while working with the records at Oseredok. The first example comes from the Donna Gresko collection. Donna Gresko began playing the violin at the age of 5, and by 14, she was described as a genius by British pianist, composer, and Royal College of Musicians professor Arthur Benjamin, who was also the adjudicator at the Manitoba Musical Festival. Pursuing a career as a professional musician would undoubtedly have placed a great deal of stress and pressure upon Donna and her family, and there's example in at least 2 records. The first here is a letter from Michel Pastro, Donna's instructor, from April 6 of 1947. It is clear that there were concerns regarding whether Donna was performing a recital in New York, and Pastro clearly states his feelings on the matter, specifically how important this will be for Donna's career by exposing her through good press. There's also the cost of the recital running up $800 or $11,400 in today's money with inflation. This is no small change, especially considering that multiple recitals were proposed. 7 years later, in an interview for the Toronto Daily Star on February 17, 1954, Donna provided some more detail and personal insight into her musical career. Here, in her own words, she states that talent alone is not enough. The true path to success requires significant investment. We also see that she took a practical attitude towards her craft. In response to concerns that some had regarding her decision to play at nightclubs and occasional casinos, she stated that there is an excitement about the work that is good for a musician or a dancer. Some people seem to think that I should be idle unless I can be on a concert tour. I do not believe that outlook is good for anyone anxious to perform. This sentiment demonstrates that while she still clearly did feel pressures of pursuing a musical career, she had also taken what may have been considered an unorthodox or practical approach. No opportunity to play was rendered invalid by the class of the venue, since it helped put food on the table and allowed her to pursue her passion of playing the violin. Before I was fortunate enough to process this fond, I had heard of Peter Kutch and his work only in passing. Therefore, it was a real treat to examine numerous examples of his talent, including, of course, his editorial cartoons. It is always interesting to find older records and materials that, when viewed from a modern perspective, gain the property of being unintentionally prophetic. For example, in this example from the Winnipeg Free Press on Thursday, June 8th of 1961, we see a teacher attempting to utilize TV to educate a student, while the pupil instead directs his attention towards cartoons using a miniature TV hidden within his desk. Originally, this would have been a commentary on the increased adoption of television by the public, possibly. Unbeknownst at the time, this scenario would in fact prove very real. However, it has been made possible through the widespread adoption of cell phones. Today, teachers utilize desktops and projectors in efforts to educate students who indulge in a similar form of escapism as this pupil here, but through their laptops and their cellular devices. Another one which caught my eye was a rare example of direct continuity between multiple cartoons. Initially published on May 27, 1975, the image on the left depicts a mailman feigning illness with the very rather sharp threat of suspension hovering over him should he be found out. 2 days later, however, Free Press readers retreated to the exact same scene, but with a few changes. Kutch is now depicted as addressing the fact that it was not in fact postmen who were feigning the illness, and he is rectifying his error personally within the cartoon. The original error could simply have been treated as a one-off and ignored, and he could have simply gone off on creating more cartoons. However, this stuck out at me since I'm not used to seeing this sort of immediate continuity within single panel editorial. And it is also good to see that Kutch took the topic matter and this trade seriously enough in order to pursue this correction. Now, of course, Peter Kutch did more than draw editorial cartoons for the Winnipeg Free Press. He also did other artistic work and was a freelance artist. One impressive example is his alternative work for the Free Press for their July 21st, 1969 issue celebrating the Apollo 11 moon landing. After having spent a significant amount of time organizing the editorial cartoons, this was an impressive piece that was also a breath of fresh air. What was also equally impressive, but with a bit of an air of mystery, was some of his freelance work for a collection of Ukrainian folklore stories. Aside from the artistic talent that went into these, there's also the mysteriousness of where they came from and what they were for, because these pages were left on their own. There was no book to be included with and no immediate indications to what book they were part of. Further research would most likely unveil this, but for now it remains an interesting mystery. As already stated, you can find very interesting information within a font that has little to nothing to do with the subject of the material within it. Such information can either be immediately identifiable through the existing materials or as the result of a deeper analysis. In Winnipeg, it sometimes seems that everybody knows everybody else. And in this case, the discovery was made to the name of an obituary for Donna Gresco's second husband, Carl's Ernest Dojak. It was this last name that struck me since it was one I was well acquainted with. Prompted by this discovery, I was drawn to read on the obituary looking for a specific first name. And as it happens, I found it. I was able to confirm that it was Charlie's son, John, and his immediate family that I and my own have known and owned a neighboring cottage to for roughly 30 years. This was a rather pleasant and unexpected discovery. I have only heard Charlie's name in passing, and I know little to nothing of Donna, so I cannot contribute anything of significance to the Gresco collection. Regardless, this was an interesting piece of information on a personal level and will warrant, COVID permitting, sharing over happy hour this summer. This next example, I performed some external research for by curiosity. These punch cards in the John Music font caught my eye because they were obtained while at the 1964 to 1965 World's Fair in New York and seemed to be a sort of personality test done by handwriting analysis. Given that the mouse did not debut until 1968, I was intrigued as to how something as fluid as calligraphy could be translated into computational information on punch cards of all things. So I began some casual research with mixed results. I could not find any information on the IBM system beyond the mention of the porta-punch and sorting machine that were produced. Now, the former clearly does not accommodate for calligraphy in any way, and the sorting machine itself also does not give any clues into how any sort of analysis will be done. I was, however, able to find a similar machine in concept and possibly execution that was also produced for the same World's Fair. The electronic handwriting analysis machine produced by Zytronics Inc. incorporated some pretty interesting technology. Users wrote on a pad that was then projected and enlarged onto a screen in front of them. From what I can gather, however, the cards that were produced at random little more than punched fortune cookies rather than any actual analysis being performed. This would also explain the rather small computing components inside being limited to the film used to project the user's handwriting. Considering that this was the mid-60s, if any analysis were going on, there'd be a much larger computing unit inside. Regardless, this was an interesting piece of computing history, and I am pleased that I found it. A more hilarious example of indirect information comes from a newspaper published on May 11th of 1974. The reason for its inclusion in the USIC font is the front page article of Princess Margaret unveiling a bronze bust of former Mayor Steve Juba, whose election campaign was managed and run by USIC. This is very interesting, but it is not the only eye-catching article on the page. My attention was also drawn further down the page to the title of Financier's Private Luxury Plane Seized in Panama and Flown to the US. In what was a self-described act of vigilantism by A.L. Eisenhower, former pilot for then-fugitive criminal financier Robert Vesco, he somehow managed to repossess the luxury 707 plane in Panama without Vesco's knowledge and flew it back to Newark Airport. There it was impounded by receivers for one of Vesco's former organizations. This bizarre story definitely gave me cause to laugh at the mental image of a man standing on the tarmac, wondering how on earth an entire plane that he had bought had somehow disappeared behind his back. Another example, this time from the Anton Kirk font, is also derived from a newspaper. What we see before us are the somber writings and excerpts of a diary of a young, unnamed First World War soldier. There's also a lengthy article pertaining to the 61st Overseas Battalion Brigade. But as you may have guessed, that's not the only eye-catching material that was in this issue. No, the editors also felt there's great importance to figure out how the eclipse is going to affect the course of politics within the American capital. Well, it turned out that the eclipse will culminate at Washington at an angle which will exert tremendous effect upon the administration and all those in authority generally throughout the eastern section of the country, as well as upon Congress and the legislative bodies of the nation generally. The stand-patters and reactionaries of all political faiths will suffer severe reverses as a result of the tidal wave of progressive democracy. It's very good to know that the celestial bodies had studied up on then modern socio-political systems of governance before influencing the will and actions of mankind. On a final note, though, I would like to draw attention to the fact that simply because information is absent, either through exclusion or simply being missing, this does not necessarily mean that it is tangential or irrelevant. For example, this is a piece of work that Peter Kutch did on behalf of an article for the Gold Eyes. What makes this first piece significant is that the individual who chose to preserve the art, but abandoned much of the text that was the content of the article. Now, Kutch may be the subject of the poem, but the artwork was originally produced to work in concert with the article. The writing may reveal nothing new or immediately relevant regarding Kutch, but it is still an integral part of the record as a whole. This art served the purpose of drawing attention to the article and augmenting it with display for the eyes beyond the text. For this next example, the concern is with regard not so much to theory, but as practical consideration. It is interesting that Kutch was a sketch artist on behalf of the police when one would assume they would have had a sketch artist of their own. It further demonstrates to any viewer the depth of his skill. However, that is not what I want to draw attention to. As a request on behalf of current and future archivists, to current and future individuals or groups who wish to donate their time and effort into cutting out and preserving news clippings and any similar records. If it is important enough to cut out and preserve, then please include the source and the date relevant to the article itself. No matter how obvious it may seem at the time, future users would undoubtedly be incredibly grateful in every instance where time and effort can be saved trying to determine the origin of the record. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to view my presentation, and I hope I have been able to give you an interesting glimpse into a more mundane yet interesting aspect of archival work. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tatiana, and I'm the archival intern at the Oseredok. Today, I'd like to present what I've been working on for the past 3 months. In order to do this, I will share my screen with you. I'd like to focus on 2 things today. First is the contents of the fonts that I've been processing, and 2, the methodology used to restructure the fonts. I worked on 6 fonts belonging to significant Ukrainians: Eugene Deslav, William Ivaskyv, Michael Hedman, Dokia Humenna, Konkurs Spogadiv, and Cornelius Brodin. I have gone through a process of restructuring each box in the fonts by making new series, labeling all relevant items such as ACID-free folders, creating finding aid, replacing old boxes with new, creating box labels, uploading finding aid on main, putting the fonts in their original locations. The purpose of this internship is to enhance the access to the Oseredok's collections for future researchers. And as you can see on the screen already, we're going to start with the fonts of Eugene Deslav. Deslav is mostly known for his filmmaking career and diplomacy. The fonts contains items relevant to Deslav's film career and participation in Ukrainian diplomatic activity. Deslav's newspaper clippings are nicely compounded. The focus stands on his biography and film career. On the left is a drawing of him. On the right at the top is footage from his film Electrical Night. Ukrainian, French, Spanish, Bulgarian, Czech, Polish, Russian, Romanian, English, and German. These are all the languages of all the newspaper clippings in Deslav's font. This tells us that he was a known figure throughout Europe. Deslav's typescript, Diplomatic History of Ukraine, covers the period of a millennium in Ukrainian history since the times of Rus to the 20th century. I came across peculiar information across all 6 fonts. For instance, Deslav's Diplomatic History of Ukraine highlights the 1429 International Congress in Lutsk, Volyn. Aside from discussing this crucial diplomatic event, Deslav accents how much food was consumed: 700 bulls, 1,400 rams, 100 bison, 100 boars, 100 moose, 700 honey barrels, and an unknown amount of wine and beer. While reading these 3 chapters, for a second I thought Deslav is describing the current events in Ukraine and Belarus. In fact, he was actually describing the political background during the 15th and 17th centuries, which resonates with Russia's contemporary stance in Eastern European politics. These excerpts depict no modification between Russia's tactics of that time and today. We're moving on to the second font of William Ivaskyv. Ivaskyv was a Ukrainian-Canadian community leader and an active Prosvita member. His fonts consist of primarily of textual records concerning the period from the late 1920s through the 1950s, when he was an active member and leader of the Canadian-Ukrainian Institute Prosvita. This is Ivaskyv's personal Prosvita membership certificate. Ivaskyv compiled a scrapbook of his own. He collected newspaper clippings featuring Prosvita's activities alongside his own biography in some of them. One photograph different from other three is Demetrius Ilchishin, or Dmitro Ilchishin. Hedman and Brodin fonts were acquired with Ilchishin's fonts in 1981. Ilchishin and Hedman were members of Canadian Siege Organization, Канадська січова організація, and the United Hedman Organization, Союз гетьманців-державників. Serving on the board of Prosita for a number of years, spanning over 2 decades in the first half of the 20th century, Ivaskiv has preserved its numerous correspondence letters. 2 of the letters by Mikhailo Olenchuk, the first head of Prosvita, show how hard it was to run the institute during its inception. One letter delineates that Olenchuk had to sell his own car in 1920 in order to finish Prosvita's original construction. Olenchuk states that from that moment onwards, he never owned a car. 2 years later, Prosvita ran an auction during a picnic, with the prize being a suit made by Taylor Yuskiv. One of the participants, who did not win, declared that he is either going to file a police report or demand a full refund of $89. In order to prevent a disturbance during the picnic, Olenchuk agreed to make a refund by giving his own money this time again. A quote from Olenchuk's letter cites a feeling of appreciation for the selfless individual. I'm leaving this for the record of how difficult my position was and how hard it was to please some people. Молода Україна, Альманах для молоді, or Young Ukrainian Almanac for Use, complements Ivaskiv's collection in that it can refresh modern education processes by implementing the learning strategies from a century ago. This almanac also offers a glimpse at a thinking process of people in the 1920s. We're moving on to the third font of Michael Hedman, who was a World War I Ukrainian veteran, journalist, and community leader. The font consists primarily of correspondence with individuals in Canada and abroad who belonged to or sympathized with the Hedmanite movement, and with various local Canadian branches, or more accurately, paramilitary units of the Hedmanite movement. It is ironic how Hedman's last name fits the movement he was part of. Hedman means head of state. In this letter, the sender complains how the main office in Chicago branch is ignoring the letters and articles, subsequently delaying the publishing of materials. Swear words are present in this letter to show disagreement with Chicago's stance. Demonstration how much rust a metal clip leaves is present on this piece of paper at the top half of the page. To prevent rust residue on the paper, reserve to using a plastic paper clip like the green one. The depicted document is the Canadian Siege Organization's Канадська січова організація order from the command. In a case you're going to leave a spectacular legacy behind and donate crucial materials to any given institution, make sure that your writing is clearly written in order for the prospective researchers to understand what you're saying. It is pleasant for the eye to read the calligraphic writing if we compare and contrast the 2 slides. So compare it, this one to this one. I think that this one looks more pleasant to read than this one. Next font is Dokia Humanas. Humana was a writer with a legacy of 25 works. The fonts consist of 2 published works and 9 draft typescripts authored by her. Humana's work, Veliki Tsabe, or The Big Shot, deals with the topics of social issues, traditions, outdated practices, and feminism. Two of her published works in the collection are Діти чумацького шляху, Children of the Milky Way, and Вічні вогні Альберти, Eternal Flames of Alberta. Конкурс спогадів is the fifth fond that I dealt with. In 1947, the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center, Oseredok, sponsored a memoir writing competition. Participants submitted memoirs related to the major events of the first half of the 20th century in Ukraine. 65 memoirs were entered into the competition, the vast majority submitted by Ukrainians residing in displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. They represent one of the earliest collections of Ukrainian memoirs concerning World War II, the closest in time to the events depicted. The topics include, but are not limited to, exile, German work camps, conditions under the Soviet regime, sporadic mentions of the Holocaust, and personal childhood experiences. Memoir number 8 by Petrus, named Sovietsky Aresztanty, Soviet Convicts, is dedicated for the people deceived by rat propaganda, as he states. This memoir contains a poem about what the convicts had gone through in the Soviet exile, the one on the right-hand side. The memoirists were not happy with the forced life experiences and had a justifiable contempt feelings towards the regime that some memoirs come with correspondence from authors stating that since they're not professional writers, they grant Oseredok editing rights. One person went a little bit further and said if Oseredok does not see value in their entry, they can burn it. The winning entry by Федір Правобережний has been published under the title Велика Вітчизняна війна, спогади та роздуми очевидця. The Great Patriotic War, Memories and Reflections of an Eyewitness in 2002. So we've moved to the last fonts of Cornelius Brodin. He was a Manitoba provincial agronomist, lecturer, writer, president of St. Raphael's Ukrainian Immigrants Welfare Association of Canada. The fonts consist of correspondence, photographs, postcards, and publications related to Brodin's volunteer work for the Товариство опіки над українськими переселенцями імені Святого Рафаїла and to his job as a Manitoba provincial agronomist. Brodin's personal photo was taken in 1904 while he was drafted into the army. In 1931-1932, he traveled to Europe, in particular to Eastern Galicia, then part of Poland, currently Ukraine, as the St. Raphael Society's representative. His observations were detailed in Podróż do Europy, The Voyage to Europe, in 1933. Brodin collected the photographs of the Maslow Soyuz Butter Union Cooperative during his trip. A large photograph is the demonstration of how photographs should not be treated in reference to proper handling. Hands should be clean while handling photographs of any kind in order to not leave any residue, in this case, fingerprint. Okay, so now we're gonna move to the technical side of my job placement, and I'm gonna show you how I organized everything. Here's a stack of coroplast boxes that all fonts were originally stored in with old labels, the blue and green ones and the white ones. Here's a stack of Hollander boxes that all fonts are stored in now with new labels, the white labels. On this image, you see two boxes placed beside each other. The one on the left is white coroplast box, on the right is charcoal Hollander box, which replaced all coroplast boxes. Old and new labels are seen on these boxes as well in comparison. To secure easy location of the fonts, each box has its unique label containing vital information such as institution name, font's title, accession number, location, total number of boxes, and specific box number. Here's a demonstrated open Hollinger box and the alignment of acid-free folders with contents inside. The folders have to have this vital information written on them. Manuscript number, accession number below it, font's title, series title, folder title, year, box number, folder number. The brown item you see is the original packaging for Humana's typescripts. It is part of the collection and is also placed in the acid-free folder. Most of the fonts contain photographs which are kept in transparent sleeves with vital font information such as accession number, font's title, series title, box number, folder number, total number of photographs. On the left-hand side is a photograph inside the sleeve with a label. Each section is color-coded. Originally, when I labeled the photograph and the sleeve, I didn't have the accession number. But now I do, and will eventually add it to the identifying information on all photographs in the Slav's fonts. I am obstructing the photograph of the Slav. He is on the right-hand side. Well, this only tells you that you'll have to come and see the collections yourself to see how he actually looked like. Sorry, this is a technical issue. This is the format that I followed for filling in finding aid. Name of fonts, collection summary, biography, scope and contents, detailed description are one of the most considerable details of the finding aid. Compiling finding aid was a second big step after physically going through the fonts to designate series, reorder folders, and assign chronology. Anyone who is looking for information on these fonts can find it on MAIN, the Manitoba Archival Information Network. It is a digital database of archival material powered by an archival software ATOM, access to memory, supported by AMA, Association for Manitoba Archives. The focus of MAIN and ATOM lies in making the collections as accessible to the public, so that means you. This is the information I entered on MAIN. Yellow highlights represent the fields that have been filled with a description of the archival holdings. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. If anyone is eager by this time to learn more about the collections, should personally come and see them. Thank you.